Hello and welcome to the 33rd episode of the Special Needs Voice podcast. My name is Aaron. Our goal with this podcast is simple, to share the stories and perspectives from the top leaders in our special needs community. By the conclusion of each episode, we hope you have laughed at least once, learned something new, and are better equipped to handle your next challenge. Today, Mike Walther, founder and president of Wealth Advisors, will be speaking with Burdette Williams. Lee is the executive director of the College Autism Network, an organization leading the way in improving access, experiences, and outcomes for neurodivergent college students. They offer resources that help both the individual and institutions create more inclusive and supportive campuses. In this conversation, Lee shares what inspired her to join the College Autism Network and how she's working to fill the gaps she noticed throughout her career in higher education. Guided by the question, what could be different? Lee's passion for supporting neurodivergent students continues to make an evident impact across campuses nationwide.
Well, hi everyone, this is Mike Walther from Wealth Advisors, and I could not be happier to be bringing to you today Burdette Williams, the Executive Director of the College Autism Network. She has an amazing background, and she's going to tell you what she's doing now and where the future for autism and education might be going in the future. Lee, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Maybe we should start with your background. Your website bio starts this really cheeky admission that as a young person, you might have been a bit of a troublemaker back in nursery school, and yet you've moved through higher academics in many different ways. So tell us about your background.
Yeah, that is true. And if my late mother were here, she would confirm all of this. I was literally expelled from nursery school. And that started me on a long path of challenges with really, I think, I just had a different vision for my education than many of my teachers might have had, and that caused a lot of problems. But it really did, I think, sensitize me to students who just see things really differently. I was really all through college and into graduate school. I was really interested in community mental health and the way that organizations do or don't support the individuals they're responsible for. It led me to a career in student affairs, working in higher education, and I kind of came up through a very traditional path in that field, where I was a director of student activities, a director of orientation, director of a student union, worked in residence life, worked in admissions, and then eventually kind of worked my way up the ladder to be the dean of students at University of Connecticut. And then realizing that I was much more of a small school kind of person, made the transition to be VP and dean of students at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. And I was there for some truly wonderful years, but for a variety of personal and professional reasons, kind of decided to make this change. I was really interested in this growing number of students coming to campus who seemed to really struggle both socially and academically. And the traditional responses to students who were struggling didn't always seem to be enough. And I've been fortunate to work with some professionals in the disability field from whom I have learned a tremendous amount, and started learning about students with a diagnosis of Asperger's at the time and autism now, and really seeing the ways in which the college environment isn't built at all for them. And what could be different? That was really the question I have. What could we do differently in the environment rather than keep requiring those individuals to adapt to the environment? And we've done that. We have a long history in our field of changing the environment to better respond to students who had been previously marginalized. And you can go back in higher education and you can look at the ways in which colleges changed how they did things to accommodate women, to accommodate LGBT students, to accommodate students of color. And there's always this shift, right? Like you bring in an outsider to an environment where they don't fit, and you say, figure out how to fit. And after repeated failures of that experiment with many different individuals, the institution really begins, hopefully, with voices at the front of the room saying, like, we need to look at ourselves. What are we doing differently? What could we do differently that would make a difference for these outsiders so that they're no longer outsiders? So that's always been the context of my work. So working with these students who were diagnosed as autistic, I just was like, what could we be doing differently? And on my own campus, for me, it was really helping to educate my staff about supporting neurodivergent students And it was a time when I didn't even know that word. I just knew, and the disabilities folks would say, this is what's going on. And that's what led me to work to make the change to go work for Mansfield Hall in Burlington, Vermont, a newly created academic and residential support program for college students in Burlington who needed more than their campuses were offering them. And again, I was seeing it like, oh, that college could be doing a lot more for these students, but they're not. So how can we fill in that gap? And that connected me with the College Autism Network, which was founded by Brad Cox in 2015, and started doing a lot of training and outreach to colleges and universities that were seeing this need and wanted to make a difference for those students. And that was really the formation of CAN as kind of a membership association. In 2017, we hosted our first summit. We just invited everybody we could find by Googling, autism and support in college, and about 70 people showed up for that first summit in Burlington. And what they really wanted, in addition to that summit itself, was an opportunity to connect and network with each other, because people were working really in isolation on their own campuses. So it was heartening for them to meet other people who did similar work, and they just wanted to be in touch with each other. And so we had to really build this organization to provide that network. And that's how we got to where we are.
That's incredible. And I think we'll get into more of the details of CAN and what it's doing and how broad the network has become. Maybe we can go back a little bit. So in all of your roles through academia, you became Dean of Students at 2 schools. You were heavily involved in many different aspects of the university and campus life. What was the trigger, if there was one, that really helped you see that the neurodivergent community needed more support and you wanted to focus your efforts on that topic, if there was one?
Well, on most campuses, there is a lot of attention paid to the retention of students. And so on any campus, you have your admissions folks, and they're responsible for recruiting, marketing, bringing in the class. And then there's a moment, really, and sometimes on some campuses, it's a very clear moment when that class is handed off from the admissions office to the faculty and to the staff that are going to be working with them. And then that class becomes their responsibility. And you've spent a lot of money recruiting and admitting those students. And so it's in an institution's best interest to retain them through to graduation, because replacing a student who departs is expensive, right? So institutions obsess over their retention rate, and they compare it with other retention rates at other institutions, and they look at all of the variables that should have you at like 81%, but we're at 79. What's happening with those 2%? And there's lots of research on the campus that goes into figuring out, like, why are students leaving? And as a student who transferred myself as an undergrad, I know that it's never one thing, right? Like, there's always sort of this combination of factors. And there are always people on campus who meet and regularly talk about, like, there are retention task forces, and pour over the data and who's leaving. Oh, it's all the out-of-state students. We need to do more interventions for the out-of-state students, make them feel more at home. Maybe we should recruit fewer out-of-state students, right? Lots of obsessing over this. In the role of Dean of Students, I'm always looking at the students who are really just struggling, and we can predict, based on what we know, that this student is not going to last. So how do we get upstream of those struggles to figure out how to keep them here? And one of the groups that always came up was these students who just seemed to be sort of so socially awkward and inept and weren't fitting in and finding their way. And they had not yet, and maybe they wouldn't ever, connect with a faculty member in a really profound way. Like, you can have a, kind of weird kid who's awkward and uncomfortable in social situations, but they're brilliant, and this professor is brilliant, and they see in each other a comrade, and so that student becomes the lab assistant, and the next thing you know, that student's off to grad school in biochemistry because of that connection. Well, what happens when that connection isn't there? And some of those students are occasionally disruptive in class, and so then you can put them through the conduct process, but that seems really unkind. And so for me, there were just a few students when I was at Wheaton who I just puzzled over and talked a lot about with our Dean for Disability Services. And that was a one-person office. And she was doing all of the translation and all of the navigating for, hundreds of students who had, mobility impairments and visual impairments and learning disabilities, and this group that were autistic. And there were just a couple of students that really, I talked to their parents, and the parents are like, but you said this would be a great place for them. You said they'd get all the individual attention that they needed. And that's when I realized what the admissions office sells is not exactly how we see it. But I came to understand that parents just hear things differently because they're coming out of a very different environment in that high school, that K-12 environment where their student has been profoundly supported, deeply supported.
Right.
A high school will go to great lengths to help a student be successful, provide, individual one-on-one aids, an opportunity to take a test 4 different times before they get a passing grade, and then that's the grade that's recorded. In colleges, we don't do that. And so these parents, they'd be in my office in like late September, early October, as things were just melting down. Like, the student was totally off the rails. Really, it was clear the student was not going to make it. And I'm trying to negotiate this, medical withdrawal or to help them get some of their money back, maybe a little. And the parents are just like, but you said this was a good place for my daughter or my son. And and then our disability dean would say, yeah, she's autistic. And I was like, how do I not know about this? I've worked in higher ed my whole career. I have a doctorate in college student personnel administration. At what point did I miss something about working with these students? And I realized that our profession of student affairs has just not done a good job educating the people like me who were attracted to the field because we like student activities and orientation and residence life. And so for me, that was like, well, I'm gonna take this on. I'm tired of hearing these parents and having them break my heart because their hearts are broken, and I'm gonna do something different.
Well, on behalf of all the families who have a neurodivergent member, and that's, I don't know, maybe 25% of the population at this point.
A lot of them.
Seems like a lot. I really appreciate you making that pivot. Maybe you can share with all the listeners some of the benefits that the partners in CAN get from being a member, whether it's a university or some affiliation group or individual that's going to be partnering up with CAN. What are the benefits of being connected?
Well, I think the most essential is the network. In the last few weeks, we've had some Zoom calls, and all of the program directors that I have on my mailing list, which is always expanding because I'm pretty liberal about who I'll put on it, they get invited to just come to a Zoom call, and we say, how are things going? What are you struggling with? And someone will say, I'm finding that my students this year are really resistant to our peer mentoring efforts. Has anybody else found that? And then this conversation ensues with 25 people on the screen, with people saying, yeah, I found that too. Or someone else saying, that hasn't been my experience, but here's how we do it differently. So the amazing benefit of plugging into a power grid of expertise that's national, international. So there's access to that network. There's access to the research. There's great research going on so many different campuses related to autistic students. And every month we have our Canvas call. Canvas stands for CAN, Virtual Association of Scholars. And it's run by our director of research, Brett Nachman. He invites someone who's either just published some research or is in the late stages of doing some research to present their research to a group of interested people. And again, 25 or 30 people will show up for that and listen to what somebody has been discovering through this research, might ask some provocative and helpful questions, might affirm the research, might question the findings. And we've been doing this for, I think Brett said the other day, 7 years, every month, except we take June and July off. And so dozens and dozens of presenters of research. So our CAN members are getting this cutting edge research delivered right to their screen, and they're hearing about it while it's in progress. So that's, I think, a second tremendous benefit. Third is just the resources that we have collected and continue to collect. If you go on our website, you'll find the database of autism support programs. So you can look that up and say, oh, there is somebody else in my state who's got one of these programs. I think we need to have coffee. There's a research repository, we call it, which is where a lot of research articles are you can find. So if you're starting a new research project, you go to that repository and you can find a lot of really good citations to start working with. We have a lot of resources for families. And while it's great when families find their way to those resources, the initial intention is that our members use those resources with the families that are coming to them. Right. So, you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. Somebody else has already done that webinar. Somebody else has written that article. And that's, behind the Inclusive Academia YouTube channel, right, is like, give this resource to the families that are coming to you saying, my son's autistic, but I think that he's really interested in your school. I don't know anything about how to prepare him. What do I do? Well, those program directors, they're really busy managing the students who are currently enrolled, trying to keep them successful. So it's hard for them to spend an hour on the phone with a family of somebody who may or may not even enroll. So we put these resources together and say to our members, just use it all. Use it, like send it out. Use this, share this website, share this link, share this video, and save yourself from having to do it over and over again.
That's awesome. Are you finding that high school, college counselors are aware of the network and the database so that they can direct their families to look at potential schools that might have better supports than others for their loved ones?
It is a very astute question, Mike, because you would think that this is a resource that those people, high school campuses would discover and use. It's really one of the most vexing challenges in our field. And as I have dug in and had a lot of conversations with people, I've really tried to understand the scope of this problem. One of them is, so when we talk about colleges and universities, there are 3,500 approximately, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 nationally. And their professionals tend to belong to national organizations, and those become the conduit to get information out to those colleges and universities. There are tens of thousands of school districts. Right. Even in a small state like Connecticut, where I live, there are hundreds of school districts. 185 school districts. And Connecticut's like this big, right? And I've come to realize that these school districts, it's kind of like every tub on its own bottom. Like they sort of function independent of one another, and we haven't cracked the nut of how to communicate with those school districts in as efficient a way as we communicate with college and university professionals, because there's so many of them. They also, in a high school, in a typical, like say public high school, or maybe even like a large private high school, you got your guidance counselors, you got your college counselors, right? And they're the ones who are working with students to help them come up with their list of schools to apply to. And then you've got your transition counselors, and that's a very specific role. Transition counselor is the person who is responsible for the planning of post-secondary or post-high school life for every student who has an IEP.
Right. Yep.
And some students have IEPs because they have intellectual disabilities. Some of them have IEPs because they have chronic physical illnesses. Some are autistic, neurodivergent, ADD, ADHD. Some of them have mobility impairments or visual impairments or hearing impairments, and they all have IEPs. And this one person, this transition counselor, is responsible for figuring out what all of these kids are going to do when high school is over. And so it's 5 miles broad and 3 inches deep in terms of what they know and are able to do. And their caseloads are too big, and they're trying to work with families, and we have a lot of like tiger moms and dads who've had to become those tiger moms and dads because the system is not really set up to benefit them. It's like, if you complain enough, we will do these things, but we're not going to offer them, which is why the loss of federal leverage is so disturbing, right? When Linda McMahon says, we're going to return the responsibility for taking care of students to the states, everybody at the state level is like, yeah, we don't do that well. That's why you exist, right? And so, the fear for these families is there's now no leverage, there's no hammer to bring to bear on this school system that's not doing enough for my kid. And this transition counselor is right in the middle of that. So how do we get information in their hands when, they're kind of all over the place with these kids? And so parents are really the best resource. But, for a lot of these, so then that's one of the problems, which is like sheer volume.
Right.
That makes it difficult to do. The other is that those transition counselors tend to not know a lot about the college environment. For most of them, they went to college, so they know that. Like they know one college or maybe two. They might know like where they got their master's, but they don't have the broad scope of the ADA and what it requires and what it doesn't require. They have never worked in a disability services office on a college campus trying to figure out how to balance accommodations and academic rigor. So they are giving, and neither do the college counselors really in general. So they know like a dozen schools and they say, apply to these schools, or, let's do a database search and we'll find you 5 schools to apply to. But they don't know what's waiting for that student when that handoff happens from admissions to the rest of us. Like if I could figure that out, that would be such a game changer.
Well, hopefully between Google and AI searches and other things, people are going to start finding the College Autism Network, because I think the good news you can share is that from the early groundwork you guys did, it's grown to be a lot of different organizations and members. How big are you all now, and how many college campuses have supports through CAN to offer to their students?
Well, we have about 1,100 paid members. Some of those are individual members, so a person can just join as an individual. Maybe they don't have institutional support to do so. But we also have organizational memberships. Small, large, and extra large institutions can join and pay one price and then have a certain number of professionals kind of under their membership. So we have a couple of hundred of those organizational memberships, and then under them, are a lot of those 1,100 members. And then the other probably relevant numbers of the colleges and universities that are in our autism support database. It's about 150 or 60, and they meet certain criteria. The primary one being we have a defined autism support program, like it's this, and those aren't the only schools that are supporting autistic students. Hundreds and hundreds more are doing great work supporting autistic students, but they haven't coalesced around a specific program. They just have a great person or great people in their disability services office, and maybe they've done training with faculty and staff, and it's just a better, more neuro-inclusive environment. That database is really one of the things that launched us. Was people, it started as a research tool, because our researchers wanted to kind of compare apples to apples. And so let's create a data set. And that's really what that database started as. And then people were like, that's a really valuable data set. Can we see it? And so we kind of turned it into this database, and it's different. The one thing I'll say is, so the National Coordinating Center for Inclusive Post-Secondary Programs, Think College is what it's called, located at UMass Boston. They have a database. They have about 350, 400 schools in their database. And we really try to draw this distinction. Inclusive post-secondary programs support students with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. And the programs that are in their database are quite often programs located on a college campus, but they are not matriculating students.
Got it.
And they're not earning academic credit. And the focus is really going to be on vocational skill development and independent living, right? But it's on a college campus. And there's a lot of reasons for that have to do with, federal funding and stuff. Our programs enroll students who've been admitted through the traditional admissions process, are earning academic credit, and are working their way toward graduation. So they are not the same populations. There's some crossover, which is another whole interesting thing, but those are really two distinct databases. And our database is for those families that are saying, my son, my daughter is capable of doing college level work. with the right supports. Where are those supports? And they find their way to us.
Well, it's such a blessing that those supports are now there. I know that when my brother was graduating high school, that these things just didn't exist 40 years ago. And to see those opportunities now for these young people who have the ability, they just need a little extra help or a little support on campus, to have that available is amazing.
40 years ago, your brothers, in that era, colleges and universities were not obsessing about retention. Like that was what changed everything.
Interesting.
It was like, well, we got to figure out how to keep these students. Let's figure out why they're leaving. And then that kind of led to a lot of the development of these support programs.
Yeah, it's obviously amazing to think about how you can take that potential and grow it with the right supports. And sadly, how many people might have fallen through the cracks in prior decades without the supports that could have done something amazing, but just didn't have the opportunity.
Oh yeah. I think back to my own college experience. And so, yeah, I was in college in the early 80s. And, I sometimes think back to some of I graduated from a very small college. Some of the students there that, if I had known better, would have clearly said, this is an autistic student. But, from the peer perspective, it was just like, that kid doesn't fit in. Why does she act that way? Like, what are some of the issues? And, I even think of earlier days in my career when looking back with the lens that I have now, realize how I totally missed the boat on a lot of those autistic students who probably could have succeeded if they had gotten the right support.
Well, unlike many others, you've obviously made the pivot and you're helping all those people now. And that's awesome for you to do that. Maybe share with our listeners a couple of the amazing successes that CAN has brought to the people on college campus, or even just the college campus that have been transformed by having those additional services available to students.
I think one of the things that we really strongly believe in is the need for a campus to become invested in supporting its autistic neurodivergent students, that it can't be one office. And again, that's kind of going back to how higher ed has changed over these decades. We used to have this model, right, where we had the Center for LGBT students, and anybody who's queer or gay, if they want any kind of support or understanding, that's where they go, or these, African American Cultural Center or whatever. And it was this real kind of balkanization of the institution. Like, you're this kind of student, you get support there. You're this student, you get support there. But support in these piecemeal ways isn't really going to change the game for a lot of students. And so you really have to get faculty and staff to recognize that these are all of our students. Like we have a communal responsibility to every student we admit. So again, think back historically, where you have the sociology professor and and a student comes out to them like, I think I might be gay. And that professor would be like, I don't know anything about this, but I know who you can call, right? Hang on, right? And
that'd be
and
true.
Yeah, and that was routinely what happened. Like, everybody stayed in their own lane. And I don't know anything about what it means to be Black on a predominantly white institution, but I know who does. I'm going to send you there. And I think gradually over time, we started to realize that, and the word ally, right, became this kind of constant refrain on our campuses. You may not be Black, but you can be an ally. You may not be gay, but you can be an ally. What does that mean? Well, go through this training and start to understand how the world looks, how this campus looks through the eyes of a student who's Black or gay. And so, what really shifted the culture of these campuses, not all of them, but many of them, to see the responsibility that we all have and the difference that sociology professor or that white staff member can make if they don't just try to shove the student off on someone who looks or acts more like them. So it's the same now with autistic students. And I think, that's really deeply in our DNA as an organization. We really do focus on the idea of the autism inclusive or autism friendly campus, and have created a program called the Autism Inclusive Campus Designation. And we're just piloting that this year with 7 schools. And those 7 schools have committed to, well, somebody on their campus is committed to kind of bringing the campus along to turn it into a more inclusive environment for autistic and neurodivergent students. And, at the heart of that is just the idea of universal design for learning, which faculty have been hearing about in their workshops from the Center for Teaching and Learning forever. But really, that's what it is. Like, how do we create an environment where these students don't have to ask for special help, because it's sort of how we do things here. So I think for me, that's, one of our best successes right now is the launch of this program. And the other thing that I'd point out maybe is what we call our Square One. Square One is for people colleges and universities that want to get this started, and they get support and mentoring, and they are part of a cohort of schools that are starting this off. And so, I'm really pleased to see those 2 programs really growing our numbers.
No, but that's great stuff about what's going on there. So let me go to the next question, which will be, so Lee, every year you guys have been holding a summit for the College Autism Network group. And this year's summit's coming up probably even before this podcast is going to drop for public consumption. Can you share with everyone what the main goals are for this year's event and what you're hoping to have all the members get out of attending together?
Yeah, I would say over this is our 9th year, and it's what's grown is, aside from the number of attendees, is our approach to, what I think of as the three buckets of our work. And this is based on transition theory, an academic theory created by Nancy Schlossberg. Moving in, moving through, moving on. Like, those are the 3 stages of any transition, whether that's your life transition or, employment. For us, I think of moving in as really a focus on how to help those families make smart decisions, how to help students be realistic in their expectations around what they are going to encounter. Moving through is really about the programmatic and support aspects, like what happens when the student is in college. And then moving on is really about workforce transition and, what's going to happen after that. So really, since probably our 2nd summit, I've always planned with those 3 things in mind. Do we have content that's really good for those folks who are trying to help families make smart decisions? Do we have good tools for the toolkit when you're working with students who are autistic? And then what's our connection to employers and employment specialists? So there's that, and then there's this underlying real commitment that we've had since day one to having researchers and practitioners talk to each other, right? That practice should inform research and research should inform practice. And if you can get those people in the same room and get them answering and asking the questions of each other, it elevates both researchers and practitioners. So for us, the goal of the summit is to create content that taps into those 3 buckets and is encouraging and creating opportunities for researchers and practitioners to talk with one another. So if you look at our summit agenda, you'll see, I think, 48 breakout sessions, and it's a wide variety of content, and that content can pretty much fall into any one of those 3 buckets. But you'll also see these really intentional networking opportunities. Like, we're very into building relationships with among people who are there. Probably more than any conference I've ever been to is this intentionality around putting people in proximity to one another and having conversations in the hallways and over lunch that really grow that network and strengthen that network. And so people tell us all the time that some of the best professional connections that they've made throughout their careers came from sitting next to somebody in a session in the summit, and they started to talk afterwards, and then they had coffee, and then when they went back to their campuses, they stayed in touch. So
it's going to make you feel great. I mean, that's such an incredible benefit for those who attend.
Yeah. So I'm really proud of that. And one other thing I'll say is that our keynote speaker this year, every year we try to bring a speaker in who has something interesting to say, but kind of from a distance, right?
Okay.
And we've had some great keynote speakers. This year, my challenge to the planning committee was nobody knows more about this field than this group collectively knows. So can we find a keynote speaker who knows this group and can really speak meaningfully to members as a as a peer, but who's also provocative and interesting. And so, our keynote speaker, Jess Monahan, has been a CAN member for years, and she's presented for us before. She does great research at the University of Delaware, and she's a fabulous speaker. And so let's get Jess to kick us off. And yeah, it's always hard because like conferences, you like to have some big name speaker or somebody who's just written a book and we've had those, and I suspect that Jess's keynote will be more meaningful to the folks in the audience than anybody that we've had in the past.
Well, I'm sure she'll be wonderful, and that's great news for those who'll be attending in a couple of weeks. Maybe we'll leave the last question to you with what you hope the legacy will be for CAN. Hopefully, we've got a number of years left in playing this role that you're in now, but when those days are over, what do you hope the legacy will be when Lee Burdette Williams is no longer running CAN?
Yeah, well, I do think about it occasionally, sort of succession planning, because for better or worse, a lot of CAN sort of exists in my head, like organizationally, and that's not a good place for us to be. And so we've developed we have a new board of directors now, so that was a change for us this year. We're about to hire another person to come work for us, and so that'll be really different. I hope that going forward, CAN is an organization that remains focused on relationships and networking, never becomes competitive and proprietary, that we always lead with a generous spirit and keep our focus on these students. We always have to distill our work down to this single student in the home of a family that is trying to figure out how that student can have their best chance at success. And if we can always keep our focus on that one student, then it's really what directs us to do the work we do. And I think it's too easy sometimes to lose sight of that. So, I hope that I am helping to build an organization that is always mindful of the individual student and the difference that it can make when an institution is open and accepting of who they are and doesn't try to reshape them to fit into an environment.
That's pretty impressive. And I think you're well on your way to having that be the legacy. The work you've done has been amazing. I've really enjoyed watching it from the sidelines. And, not to make this political, but if the Department of Education ever wants to change direction, you'd be a fantastic leader for the country because your big heart is there, your work you're putting in, and your collaborative attitude to make everyone stronger, not just pick up one, but pick up all in the process is just amazing. Thank you for all the work you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. That is very kind of you. And I can't think of a worse place to work these days than the federal government, but maybe
all right, then we'll keep your work on the sideline doing it better that way. I appreciate that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being with us today. We look forward to getting this out to a lot of people, and we'll get the networking information for CAN so people can find you more easily. And also, I'd suggest if people want to Google and look up Lee's work as a blog artist, she's written some wonderful things. I went down some rabbit holes reading some things. A great writer, a great person, as you've just heard today. Look her up, follow CAN, and see how CAN can help your community and your loved ones. Thank you, Lee.
Thanks. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for listening. Please refer to the show notes on how to connect with Lee. If you would like to suggest a guest for a future podcast, please email me at aaron@oakwealth.com. See you next time.